Hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden. It's time for another how to grow guide. And we're going to be focusing on fava beans. And under fava beans we have two brilliant crops. We have broad beans and also field beans. Now the most important thing to understand about these, unlike the majority of the crops that you grow, they need deep roots. So effectively you have two options. You can either choose a deeper root trainer like this, or if you want a budget version of a root trainer, you just get a tray like this, fill it with loo roll tubes, fill each one with compost. Now, when I was younger, I used to try and make these into individual pots. I haven't got time for that anymore. So you can actually just fill this up. Don't worry about covering the base, pack it in. And that is a real simple root trainer for starting off. Now, broad beans and field beans are great because they're nice and hardy, which means you can start them off nice and early in the year. You can also, as long as you have a fairly mild winter, can overwinter broad beans and field beans here in the UK. It's when it gets down to about -8 degrees Celsius where some varieties don't do as well. The one that I'm growing today is Aquaculture Claudia, which is known to be nice and hardy. You might also be wondering, what is this cardboard box doing in front of me? Well, I want to show you something quite cool. I want to show you how to make a little potting tray on a budget. This isn't my idea. This is something that our colleague Lucy does, and I think it's absolutely amazing. Someone complained about me making a bit of mess, so for that one person who commented on that video, here is a simple solution to keep your potting bench nice and tidy. So you just get a general kind of veg box like this, and you break it down like that, and then you can also open up the side to keep it down, and then there you have a very nice, simple, like super easy tray to put all of your compost in to keep it nice and tidy. Now obviously if I wasn't filming, this would be the other way around, but for you to see, I'm going to do it here. I'm now going to start the sowing process, and I'm going to use just any kind of peat-free multi-purpose compost. You can use your own homemade compost. You can do a blend of that with 50-50 with some topsoil. You can add some leaf mold in. Beans, they're really not actually very fussy. So if you were doing your individual rolls, you can just pack them up from the top. But for a root trainer like this, I'll pop it in the center of the potting tray and then just start to fill it up. Once all of the cells seem full, you want to nicely firm down each one. If you have a very loose compost and your seed's growing in it, when you pull out the root ball and the seedling to transplant, all of the soil will fall away from it, and that's going to give it a little bit more of a transplant shock. So just by making sure that the compost in the individual cells is nicely firmed in, it's going to be a lot better for your seed. And also there's more contact to soil. If there's too much air and fluffiness for the seeds, what happens is sometimes the germination rates can slow down. The seeds want to be nicely packed around the compost. So I'm just going to give it a quick soaking beforehand. This just means that I don't have to worry too much about watering them in afterwards. Now that I've given that a nice watering, it's time to get my seeds. And for the broad beans, I'm just going to place each one initially down exactly in the center of each individual cell. Next up is to push each bean around 5 centimeters or 2 inches into the cell. You don't have to be too precise about this because they are just going to grow. Even if they're a little bit too deep or too shallow, don't worry about it too much. They're now all in their position. I'm going to use the fact that I've got the tray here to keep all the compost nice and tidy. I'm going to use that just to cover over the holes that have just been created. And then I'm going to give it another brief water. And that there is a process of the actual sowing. Now you might be wondering, oh, isn't this going to eventually break down the cardboard? Yes, it is, but you then put the cardboard box onto the compost pile and then you get a new one. So effectively, this is going to give you more than just putting it on the compost pile. You can get a nice little purpose from it. Once you've planted out your seeds, put them on any kind of mini greenhouse shelf that you might have in a polytunnel or even on your windowsill, and just let them grow. They don't need any base heat, just the ambient temperature is enough to make them to germinate. And make sure you just keep them nicely watered. If the top centimetre of the seedlings dries out, that's a good cue to give them a watering. You can do a base watering as well. Because it's much deeper, base watering is usually the best route to go. When the seedlings reach around 10 centimetres, 4 inches, a little bit higher, it is then time to transplant them. With fava beans, you don't need to worry about hardening them off. I just stick them outside and say good luck, and every single year they do absolutely fine. So the transplant distance you want to aim for is roughly 15 centimetres. It's quite close, 15 centimetres or 6 inches between each plant, doing a staggered pattern. By doing a staggered pattern, you can fit more plants into the same space. If you do want to give a little bit more space, perhaps for say the broad beans, you can space them out 20 centimetres apart on staggered rows, 15 centimetres wide. One of the biggest challenges that fava beans face when they grow is they can get a little bit top heavy and they're a little bit vulnerable to wind. So you can either choose varieties, for example, Sutton, which is more of a dwarf variety, or by actually planting them quite closely together, a bit like dwarf beans, they can each support each other in terms of their weight. If you are in an exposed area, you can put a few sticks around the perimeter of the beans and then tie some string around, just so it creates a bit of a fence to keep them up against each other. And when you transplant the seedlings, do firm it in. Put all of your body weight and push around the seedling, because that again is going to help create a firmer soil, so you're going to have a much stronger plant. Then you just let them grow. You can water them if you want. They respond really well from mulching with things like grass clippings. And when they start to flower, you actually want to nip off the tops of the beans. The reason why is because these are very much susceptible to black fly infestation. They go for the young tender shoots. So instead, once they start to flower, nip off the tops. You can eat these, chuck them in a stir fry, you can eat them raw, just a nice added harvest, and then you wait for the beans to develop. And in terms of when to harvest the beans, you want to make sure that the pods feels nice and firm, and you just pull off whatever you need. Usually what happens is the pods that are closest to the base of the plant, these are the ones that mature the soonest, and then over the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, the pods that are further up the stem will also come into maturity. So from a single plant, you should have a harvest period of around 2, 3 to 4 weeks. Because these are one of the first crops that you harvest, usually towards the end of June, it kind of marks the first foot out from the hungry gap, and it's an exciting one. So you've also got a lot of growing season ahead. So once the broad beans or the field beans have been harvested, you can cut them down at the base, and then you can transplant either brassicas or leeks. Both of those are great crops to follow on from a patch of beans. Fava beans are such a nice beginner friendly crop, and because of their hardiness, you can just leave them and they'll get on with life. They also do pretty well in poorer quality soil. If you have a raised bed that isn't performing so well, it's a good place to put your broad beans. And if this is the first time that you've ever heard me talk about field beans, I actually did a video which you can watch right here showing you why field beans are perhaps a better crop to grow than broad beans. So check that out and see why.